A very warm good afternoon to all of you. A very warm good afternoon to all of you. Today, today is a very great day in the history of Vishwanath College. First of all, today is the 61st foundation day of Vishwanath College. Way back in 2019, our college stepped into Diamond Jubilee year. Exactly on this day, in 2019, the Diamond Jubilee celebration started with a spectacular cultural rally. The stakeholders, authority, teachers, students of our college decided to celebrate this Diamond Jubilee for the whole of the year with year-long program. As I told you, it started with a spectacular cultural rally. And then, we all know what happened. The unprecedented COVID. Let me begin very formally. Honorable, one of the greatest intellectuals of the world of this century, and who is our guest today, Dr. Ramachandra Guha sir. Honorable Principal of Vishwanath College, Dr. Sintamani Pharma sir. Honorable participants from different parts of the country as well as different parts of the world. Honorable members of Internal Quality Assurance Cell of Vishwanath College. I, on behalf of Vishwanath College, welcome all of you to this much awaited event. And I think it is going to be a great learning experience for all of us. Now, we wanted to make this event international in every way. Therefore, the topic that we chose is of international relevance, or I can go to the extent of saying that it is of universal relevance. And we invited one person whom I personally revered so much, and then the person is regarded by the whole of the world, as I told you in the beginning, one of the greatest intellectuals. We invited him and he accepted our invitation, and we were overwhelmed with joy. And he is no other than our today's guest, Dr. Ramachandra Guha sir. I once again welcome you, sir. We're so excited to see you, and the people are getting the opportunity to listen to you directly. Now, let me come to the topic. This webinar is organized by the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of Vishwanath College, and I'm Dr. Nipam Kumar Koika. I'm the coordinator of this cell. We all know that the greatest contribution of India to the world in the 20th century is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, whom we call Mahatma. He was a charismatic saint, an astute politician, a great social reformer, a writer, a pure visionary, or prophet for the whole of the world. He became the first non-white person on British currency. A 9-foot bronze statue of him was installed in the popular medieval quarter of Manchester, making it the 6th city in the United Kingdom to feature his statue in an iconic location. And we all know that America's civil rights leader John Lewis introduced a bill in the House of Representatives to promote Gandhi's legacy. Not only that, he sought a budgetary allocation of USD 150 million for the next 5 years. On the occasion of his 150th birth anniversary, Uzbekistan honored him by issuing postage stamp, which depicts his portrait with an inscription, 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. Some of his greatest disciples are Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Chau Man-sik, and Aung San Suu Kyi. He is taken as the source of inspiration across the world to drive away the ills of the world non-violently. Before Mahatma Gandhi entered India's politics, Congress Party was merely an intellectual grouping with a motley group of journalists and lawyers. He, for the first time, brought the politics to the masses of India. For the only time in India's history, masses were seriously involved in nation building and seriously cared about something beyond their daily life. For Mahatma, most importantly, independence meant end of India's evils. Are we really independent today in Mahatma's sense of the term? Poverty and corruption are still twin brothers in India today. Crimes against women are increasing day by day, and the Nirbhaya case is one of the glaring examples of this. Gandhiji said, the day a woman can walk freely on the roads at night, that day we can say that India has achieved total independence. More than 33% of our people are yet to have access to toilets. Most of the public toilets in our country are in a very, very sad state. Poor public healthcare system, poeticide, psychological adherence to casteism, exploitation of children, illiteracy, quality education, communal violence, and poor public transportation are still the challenges for our country. In the midst of truth, says Gandhi, truth persists. In the midst of darkness, light persists. As the tenacious seeker of truth, Gandhi's status is iconic. And we invited internationally acclaimed writer who is a biographer, historian, ecologist, anthropologist, cricket writer, former visiting professor of London School of Economics, Padma Bhushan awardee, Sahitya Academy Award winner, Dr. Ramachandra Guha sir. So we are all eagerly waiting to listen to him. It will be a great learning experience. Therefore, without much ado, let me come very directly to today's agenda. As per agenda, the item number 1 is the introduction of the topic to you, which is already complete. And the second item is the inaugural speech to be delivered by our Honorable Principal, Dr. Sintamani Pharma sir. I now request Dr. Sintamani Pharma sir to give his inaugural speech. Sir, it's over to you now. Thank you. Am I audible? Yes. Am I audible? Good afternoon to all of you. Honorable today's guest, internationally acclaimed writer, Dr.
Am I audible now? Sorry. The stakeholders of the college decided to celebrate the success story in a befitting manner to honor the great souls and well-wishers who contributed significantly in making our college a thriving center of excellence. The year-long Diamond Jubilee celebration began with a spectacular cultural rally on 7 September 2019, which was the 60th foundation day of Vishwanath College. But then came COVID-19 in an unprecedented way, and we decided to carry forward virtual academic programs as part of the year-long Diamond Jubilee celebration. Today is the 61st foundation day of Vishwanath College. This international webinar on Mahatma Gandhi and his legacy is the concluding program of the year-long Diamond Jubilee celebration. From the core of our heart, we wanted to make the concluding program international in every aspect. After Buddha, Gandhi is the real international figure from India who leaves behind him an enduring legacy for which he enjoys a tremendous afterlife. We felt it to be very important to delve deeper into the enduring legacy of Mahatma. To this great event, we want to invite internationally acclaimed biographer, historian, ecologist, anthropologist, cricket writer, former visiting professor of London School of Economics, Padma Bhushan awardee and Sahitya Academy Award winner, most revered Dr. Ramachandra Guha sir as the guest. He was overwhelmed with joy when he accepted our invitation to be the guest of this webinar. Sir, I express my heartfelt gratitude to you. It is because of you only that we have got overwhelming response to this event, not only from India, but from across the world. Thank you so much, sir. Once again, I welcome all of you
to this international event as an international topic to be advised by an internationally acclaimed
writer. Let me give you an overview of our college. Named apparently after Vishwanath Temple, one of the famous as well as oldest temples in the northeastern part of India, and located in an idyllic setting, Vishwanath College, 250 kilometers away from Guwahati,
as the
heritage that goes back to almost 61 years. And it occupies a place among the premier seats of higher learning on the north bank of the river Brahmaputra. The college, known from a humble beginning on 7 September 1960, is all set to realize its potential as a seat of academic excellence in the years to come. Now we have 4 streams: arts, science, commerce, and BCA, bounded by the river Borgang in the east, river Giladhari in the west, and Himalayas in the north, and the river Brahmaputra in the south. Vishwanath Charali is one of the most important places in Assam in general and in the district of Vishwanath in particular. We are all eagerly waiting to listen to Ramachandra Guha sir. It will be great learning experience today for all of us. So without much ado, I formally inaugurate this much awaited event. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to interact with Apart sir, whom the US magazine Foreign Policy named him as one of the top 100 intellectuals in the world in May 2008. So Ramachandra Guha sir practically needs no introduction. Nevertheless, for the sake of formality, and also for the sake of some of our students, I would like to give a very, very brief introduction about him. As I told you, he is internationally acclaimed biographer, historian, ecologist, anthropologist, cricket writer, former visiting professor of London School of Economics, Padma Bhushan awardee, and Sahitya Akademi Award winner. Dr. Ramachandra Guha sir was born on 29th of April 1958 at Dehradun. He did his schooling from two institutes, that is Cambrian Hall and the Doon School. He graduated from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, with a bachelor's degree in economics, and he completed his master's in economics from the Delhi School of Economics and did a PhD on the social history of forestry in Uttarakhand, focusing on the Chipko movement from Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Having held many academic positions and taught at various universities in India, Europe, and North America, including Yale University, Oslo University, Stanford University, Guha sir has since taken up writing full-time. He has authored and contributed to more than 30 books, and his notable works include The Unquiet Woods, A Corner of a Foreign Film, India After Gandhi, The History of the World's Largest Democracy, Gandhi Before India, and Gandhi, The Years That Changed the World, 1914 to 1948. The Unquiet Woods is an environmental book that sketches the lives of peasants inhabiting India's mountainous terrains, where atrocities of environmental change are immediately and intensely experienced. A Corner of a Foreign Field portrays the social history of cricket in India. And then there are two books, as I have already mentioned, which are considered to be the massive contribution to the study of Gandhi, that is, Gandhi Before India and Gandhi, The Years That Changed the World, 1914 to 1948. In these books, Guha sir brings the past to life with extraordinary grace and clarity, drawing on a wealth of newly uncovered materials. Sharp, insightful, balanced, and impeccably researched, these books on Gandhi are indispensable resources for a contemporary understanding of Gandhi's ever-evolving legacy. Deploying his gifts as a storyteller and scholar, Guha sir in this book delves deeper into each and every aspects of Gandhi. So we are eagerly waiting to listen to him. Without much ado, I request Guha sir to begin his program. Please, ladies and gentlemen, give a huge mental applause to our today's celebrated guest, Dr. Ramachandra Guha sir. Sir, it is over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Saikia, and thank you all for coming. I briefly passed through your lovely town, Vishwanath Chariali, about 15 years ago when I was driving from Guwahati to Arunachal Pradesh, to Itanagar in Arunachal Pradesh. It's a gorgeous landscape of Upper Assam. I stopped for a day in the Kaziranga Sanctuary and enjoyed the bird life and, of course, the magnificent river. And I had, as I told Dr. Saikia when he mailed me several years ago, well before this program was conceived, a lovely vegetarian meal in Vishwanath Chariali. I also checked my email because in those days I didn't have a smartphone. So I have very happy memories of my trip there. And it's nice to be back, even if it's only virtually. So I'd very much like this to be an interactive session where questions are asked and I answer them to the best of my ability. But I'm going to just begin with a basic summation of Gandhi's social philosophy, social and political and moral philosophy. There are 90 volumes of Gandhi's collected works, actually 97, along with the supplementary volumes that were later collected. And it's a colossal volume of work. And it's impossible, of course, to distill Gandhi's ideas in one quote or one remark. But there's one particular quotation of his which I think sums up his philosophy much better than anything else. This dates to March 1922. And the background to this is the non-cooperation movement, which Gandhi started in 1920. In fact, September 1920, almost 100 years ago, there was a major meeting of the Congress in Nagpur, in Calcutta, where his non-cooperation program was discussed. Gandhi got a favorable vote among the AICC members, and this was confirmed in December at a meeting in Nagpur of the Congress, and whereupon the non-cooperation movement was launched. And as you know, the non-cooperation movement was Gandhi's first major all-India satyagraha. There'd been the roller satyagraha, before that there'd been the Champaran satyagraha of 1917, the Kheda Satyagraha of 1918, which were localized and restricted. Then there was the Roller Satyagraha of 1919 against the Draconian Act passed by the colonial regime, and that was restricted to the cities. Whereas the non-cooperation movement was an all-India campaign, cutting across the boundaries of religion, region, language, gender, class, and so on and so forth. And it seemed during the non-cooperation movement, for the first time, Indians got the sense that they could become independent, that independence would come one day, though of course it was 2.5 decades in the future. And during this non-cooperation movement, Gandhi defined Swaraj. And 100 years later, let's see what that definition of Swaraj and how much it resonates with our situation today. So Gandhi said, I'm going to quote what Gandhi said about Swaraj in March 1922, just before he was arrested. And after his arrest, of course, the non-cooperation movement collapsed. This is a quotation from Gandhi. I quote, removal of untouchability, manufacture of Khaddar, Hindu-Muslim unity, cultivation of non-violence are not measures of a temporary nature. They are the 4 pillars on which the structure of Swaraj must ever rest. So the structure of Swaraj is like a bed with 4 pillars, with 4 bedposts. And these pillars are removal of untouchability, manufacture of Khaddar, Hindu-Muslim harmony, and cultivation of non-violence. And then Gandhi says, these are the 4 pillars on which the structure of Swaraj must forever rest. Take away any one of them and it must topple down. So a bed has 4 pillars. If one pillar is weak, the whole bed will go collapse. So all 4 pillars are equally important. And this definition of Gandhi's, this short, succinct statement of Gandhi from 1922, I think expresses his philosophy beautifully. And his philosophy had 4 elements. The quotation again. Removal of untouchability, manufacture of Khaddar, Hindu-Muslim harmony, cultivation of non-violence are the 4 pillars on which the structure of Swaraj must forever rest. Take away one of them and it must topple down. So this is a beautiful summation of his moral and political philosophy. Gandhi's moral and political philosophy rested on 4 pillars. It had 4 central elements. The first element was social justice, particularly the ending of untouchability, and later on, of course, the emancipation of women. If you look at Indian society traditionally, the 2 major axes of inequality, of discrimination, of injustice, of oppression were the axes of caste and the axes of women, of gender. Women were second-class citizens and Dalits were worse than third or fourth-class citizens. They were grievously discriminated against. So Gandhi ran a lifelong campaign to eliminate untouchability and to bring women into public life. I mean, it's striking that in 1925, Sarojini Naidu is elected president of the Indian National Congress, a female president of the Congress at a time in which there were no female political leaders in the so-called advanced countries of the world like France or Germany or the United States. So social justice, particularly the abolition of caste and gender distinctions, is the first pillar of Gandhi's Swaraj. Economic self-reliance, promotion of Khaddar. Why promotion of Khaddar? Because cloth is so important and the Indian market was dominated by foreign textiles from Manchester, and Gandhi was very devoted to cultivating economic self-reliance, which also for Gandhi meant environmental sustainability. In the 1920s, Gandhi was one of the first people to recognize that if India blindly imitated Western models of economic development, industrialization, if we blindly imitated resource-intensive models of industrialization followed in Europe and North America, we would, as he said, strip the world bare like locusts. So social justice is the first pillar. Economic self-reliance, including environmental sustainability, is the second pillar. Cultural pluralism, Hindu-Muslim harmony, that was the third pillar he advocated in 1922, and that remains crucial to our survival as a nation and as a democracy. I think, particularly in the last few years, relations between Hindus and Muslims have become fraught with tension. majoritarianism is on the rise, and that is a very, very dangerous and disturbing phenomenon. And Gandhi would have been totally opposed to that. And finally, non-violence. And you settle disputes by all means. If you oppose a government policy, organize a peaceful satyagraha, but don't take up arms. Gandhi would have been opposed to Hindu fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, Maoists, anyone who used force and violence to settle a dispute. And non-violence in Gandhi's philosophy included non-violence in word, not just in deed. He was unfailingly courteous and polite in his arguments with his political rivals. If you look at his debates with Ambedkar or with Jinnah or with the British viceroys, he never used harsh or vicious or rude language. I mean, he was a model debater in sticking to his arguments, making them quietly, forcefully, but never in a savage or polemical way. So, these four pillars of Gandhi's idea. I mean, if these four pillars of Gandhi's vision for Swaraj are still entirely relevant to India today, 100 years after they were first offered. If India wants to progress as a nation, it must assure caste and gender equality. It must promote both economic self-reliance and environmental sustainability. It must absolutely insist on the equality of all religions and languages, and we must cultivate an ethic of non-violence in our everyday relations with each other. So I just wanted to start with this one quotation. As I said, there are 90 volumes of Gandhi's collected works, and there are very many interesting and unusual and still relevant things that he said. But this particular quote of his, and I'll read it out once more, and then we'll open up the webinar for discussion. Here is Gandhi writing about what Swaraj will mean to him. I quote, "Removal of untouchability, manufacture of Khaddar, Hindu-Muslim harmony, cultivation of non-violence are not measures of a temporary nature. They are the four pillars on which the structure of Swaraj must forever rest. Take away any one of them and it must topple down. Take away any one of them and it will topple down. Take away Hindu-Muslim unity and Swaraj will be imperiled. Take away abolition of untouchability, Swaraj will be imperiled." So all four pillars are equally important and vital and necessary. Thank you.
There are many people, big and small. They are talking about one thing. That is, finally, India got is not because of Gandhi, but because of Subhash Chandra. They want to put forward the argument.
Yeah.
Subhash Chandra Bose, the kind of thing that Subhash Chandra Bose started, the British, the British would assume that there a big civil war and they will be driven away forcefully, and therefore to save their nose, ultimately they transferred their power. It's because of Subhash Chandra Bose, it's not because of Gandhi. Many people say so. Sir, what is your take on that?
Yeah, so first of all, I'll come to this particular point. First of all, it is Bose would have been appalled that he was being opposed to Gandhi. Bose revered Gandhi. There's a false and pernicious opposition between Bose and Gandhi being set up. When Bose started the Indian National Army, the brigades were named Gandhi Brigade, Nehru Brigade, Azad Brigade. Bose was the first to give Gandhi the title Father of the Nation in an address given on Gandhi's 74th birthday, when Gandhi was in jail. And I urge all young people to read Bose's address in 1943, October 2nd. It's reproduced in my book, Gandhi, the Years That Changed the World, when Bose said, "Gandhi is the father of the nation. He gave us dignity. He gave us self-respect. He gave us solidarity. He organized us from the 1920s. And I'm merely building on the work that Gandhi did." So it's absolutely pernicious and appalling that people would oppose Bose to Gandhi. Bose would have been horrified because Bose revered Gandhi. He regarded himself as a follower of Gandhi. And in most respects, he was a follower of Gandhi, including on Hindu-Muslim harmony, preeminently. They disagreed on the question of non-violence and on the support to Japan and Germany. And we can have a long debate about this. Nehru and Bose disagreed on this. Nehru and Bose were also colleagues. Bose named his brigades Gandhi Brigade and Nehru Brigade. But during the war, they had a political disagreement. their personal affection remained. They had a political disagreement. Bose thought that they should support Hitler and Japan. I believe Bose was profoundly mistaken. Hitler was the most brutal and oppressive leader the world had ever known. Japanese rule would have been much worse than British rule. If you just look at the record of Japan during China. However, they parted ways. They did different things. Then Bose died in an air crash. And even while he was away, as I said, he called Gandhi the father of the nation. Please read the speech that Bose gave in 1943 on what he and the country owed Gandhi and how Gandhi and his movement gave Indians dignity and confidence and self-respect to fight for freedom. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about why the British left. The British had already decided to leave in 1945. In 1940, the Labour Party was always committed to Indian independence. In 1945, Churchill and the Conservatives lost. The Labour came to power and they immediately set in motion the process of handing over power. In 1946, there were elections. In the elections, the Congress did very well in most constituencies. The Muslim League did well in other constituencies. And the cabinet distribution came. The transfer of power was already undergoing. And the royal naval mutiny came after all this. So it is absolutely false to say that, independence was not coming. Independence was already coming. And there had been a steady transfer of power from the 1920s and 30s. So firstly, it is false and malicious and offensive to Bose's memory to claim he was greater than Gandhi. Bose, till the end, regarded himself as a disciple of Gandhi and as an admirer of Gandhi and acknowledged Gandhi's primacy in nurturing the depth of Indian nationalism. Secondly, independence was coming anyway. And the third thing, this is very important. Again, I urge you to read my book. After Bose died, Gandhi came to Calcutta. He came to Assam also in 1945-46. But he met with Bose's followers and he said, Bose and me disagreed on the question of non-violence, but we agreed on everything else. And in 1946-47, when Gandhi was traveling through Noakhali and Bihar, promoting Hindu-Muslim harmony, with him were the workers of the Indian National Army. Again, please read my book. Read what Shahnawaz Khan and Niranjan Singh Gill, who were officers in Bose's army, did to promote Hindu-Muslim harmony because they admired Bose and Gandhi both. So do not oppose Bose to Gandhi. It does a severe injustice to the memory of Subhash Bose himself. And these INA workers later on played important roles in independent India. In fact, Nehru sent Niranjan Singh Gill as an ambassador to several places. Shahnawaz Khan became an MP and then a minister. So they were they were both of the same mother source, the Indian National Congress and the freedom struggle. They occasionally had disagreements, but these disagreements were inconsequential compared to all that they shared. And as I said, those who oppose Bose to Gandhi are doing violence to Bose's memory much more than to Gandhi's memory. So please write the questions, send it to the host. Send it to Dr. Saikia, he will coordinate the questions. So, of course, we live in what is called a post-truth world. Politicians all over the world distort and pervert the truth. And that is, transparency is very important to Gandhi. That's why if critics wrote to him, he would reply. He would not dismiss the criticism. The idea that you could be prime minister for 6 years and not hold a press conference would be antithetical to Gandhi. So truth emerges from debate and discussion and the clean light of transparency. And we live in a post-truth world and everyone dissembles and tells falsehoods. And that's a sign of how far we have moved from Gandhi's politics. Yeah, Dr. Saikia.
Again, all our participants, that you just write your question on the chat box. I'll read the question out for our sir. It is just to avoid chaos. I wholeheartedly I request all of you, please. Sir, I would like to read out the second question. It is written by Mr. Shwapan Kundu that Busy is the product of and the central scripture is Gita, and Gita does not violence. Gita does not violence for the sake of a good cause. Why Gandhiji violence? At a time when violence was needed.
Yeah, so, of course, Gandhi's interpretation of the Gita is open to dispute. It's hard to say that the Gita prescribes non-violence. Hello? Yeah. But Gandhi had a deep and abiding commitment to non-violence. And I think that comes not just from the Gita, it comes from his Jain teacher, Raichandbhai. It comes from his practical experience. One of the things that influenced Gandhi was the women suffragettes in London. When he went to London in 1906 and 1909, he saw women asking for the vote non-violently, protesting. So the force of collective non-violence through Satyagraha appealed to him. And he was horrified by violence. In 1909, when he goes to London and there's a revolutionary terrorist who blows the hell out of a British official, he's appalled by it. And, I think Gandhi is absolutely, if you look at the history of those countries that achieved the independence through violence, China, France, Algeria, Vietnam, Russia, they all created totalitarian societies. To nurture democracy, you need an ethic of nonviolence. To bring together a wide and varied population such as ours, if violence would have promoted more violence, more repression by the state. There's an essay of Gandhi in 1930, The Cult of the Bomb. I urge you to read it. I can discuss this in my book. So regardless of what the Gita says, I agree, that Gandhi's interpretation of Gita is not entirely convincing. But the Gita is only one source of Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. And I think in a large, complex, diverse country, nonviolence was a much more sustainable and the long-term, you could say, advisable tool to fight for independence.
Yes, sir, I would like to come to our next question.
Yeah.
That is, Gandhi was assassinated by communal force, executive of Hindu Mahasabha in 1940. Do you think that a misdeed done by that communal force has an influence the entire Hindutva force in India, who was suppressed for the last 60 or 70 years?
No. So yes, of course. This is an open question. It still remains. So the BJP is very ambivalent towards Gandhi. A large sections of the BJP which detest Gandhi, which admire Godse. Several MPs have, praised Godse. But those who admire Godse, those who wish to build the Indian state on the basis of religion, to merge Hinduism with the state, I urge them to look at Pakistan and what has happened to Pakistan. The fate of religiously fundamentalist states is awful. In the 1960s, Pakistan was regarded as a more progressive place than India economically. But after Ziaul Haq and the Islamicization of Pakistan and the demonization of minorities, Pakistan has steadily entered a downward spiral. So those Indians who want a healthy, prosperous, caring society must beware of Godse, enchantment with Godse. Religious pride does not make great nations. America is great not because of religious pride, and I think religious pride only divides and polarizes, particularly a country like India, which is a multi-religious country. Just imagine, do you want to make 200 million Muslims second-class citizens? Just think of the consequences that will unleash. So I think I deeply worry about this adoration of Godse among young people. Particularly men who think, men who are masculine and like violence and don't understand the value of, dialogue, of tolerance, of harmony. And I think it's important for our political leadership to rein in this kind of aggressive fundamentalism.
Okay, thank you, sir. I would like to come to the next question, that is regarding Gandhi's concept of truth. The question is raised by Dr. Pranita Sharma. Do you think that Gandhi's concept of truth is relevant in the 21st century?
So I kind of answered it also when the break was happening. Of course it is relevant because truth is the best disinfectant. Citizens need to know the truth about what their government is doing. The fact that we don't even know, I'm speaking to in a webinar hosted by a college in Assam, that we don't even know whether the Prime Minister has a degree or not. Indira Gandhi did not have a degree. And she said, I don't have a degree. Indira Gandhi went to Oxford, never competed. She never claimed to have a degree, right? Manmohan Singh has a PhD from Oxford. He told us and it was there. Right. But the truth is the best disinfectant. If a leader who is truthful will not only inspire trust in his or her citizens, will run a better and more responsible government. Even today, if the Prime Minister, we are today in a terrible mess as a country. Our economy has just witnessed the sharpest downturn ever, minus 23% growth. The COVID, we are the second highest number of cases when it comes to COVID. We're going to be the highest. All kinds of problems we face. If the Prime Minister was to hold an open press conference with a leading health expert, a leading economics expert, a grassroots journalist, someone from Assam who can talk about the situation in the Northeast, and he would learn, he would be a better governor. So free flow of information, truthful, I think is very, and that's what Gandhi believed in. I mean, as I said, Gandhi ran an open house. Anyone could go to his ashram asking him a question, which meant anyone could go to his ashram and shoot him as well. That was what finally happened. So transparency is what makes great leaders, not secrecy and evasiveness and spin.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Let us come to one of the aspects, a very important aspects of any country, that is the economic aspect. The economic condition of India is very poor, particularly during crisis days. Do you think Gandhian economy will help to economic growth in the present context of India?
No, I think Gandhi's great ideas are social, moral, religious. Hindu-Muslim harmony, truth, which is moral, non-violence, which is politics, and social, which is gender and caste equality. On economics, his relevance is limited. I think he was mistaken to turn his back on many important aspects of modern economic development. I think we need to grow. We need to use modern technology. We may need large factories, but we need to do it in moderation. So I'd say a combination of classical models of economic development with the Gandhian idea of restraint. The environmental aspect of Gandhi's critique is relevant, but not all Indians can or want to live the kind of austere life that Gandhi had with no possessions at all. We have to assure every Indian a safe house, access to electricity, to drinking water, to a decent school, to a decent hospital, to dignified employment, all of which means economic growth. So Gandhi's ideas on economics are only of partial relevance. They're relevant when it comes to the environmental critique. That resource conservation should be an important part of your economic development policy, which it is not. But I think it's the social, moral, cultural, philosophical ideas that are of greater relevance than his economic ideas.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. I'm coming to the next question. That is, Mr. Irfan Ahmad is asking, Gandhi used the term secularism in different way. He used this term in a wider sense, as we all know, that India is a secular country under guidance of Gandhi. But now we have seen that there is no peace in India due to lack of toleration of other religions. What is your take on that, sir?
So that I've talked about that. That deeply worries me. It's not certainly. Nehru. I think Nehru's great contribution. Nehru's great contributions were he was totally committed to gender equality and he was committed to Hindu-Muslim harmony. I mean, when we became independent in 1947. Shortly after independence, Nehru wrote a letter to the chief ministers of states, including to the chief minister of Assam, where he said, however Pakistan treats its Hindus and Sikhs, we must give our Muslim minority equal rights. Pakistan may brutalize its minorities, but India will not follow the Pakistan model. And so long as Nehru was prime minister, there were no major Hindu-Muslim riots at all through the 1950s. To the 1950s, there was religious peace. In the 1960s, problems started. And the problems came from both sides. It came from aggressive Hindutva, and it came from the Congress parties pandering to reactionary Muslim interests. Indira Gandhi asking for the votes of the Imam of Jama Masjid and so on. The Congress party for a long time was playing footsie with Muslim clerics, which is deeply unfortunate. I mean, Nehru would never have done that. And of course, now the aggressive rise of Hindu fundamentalism threatens our social and moral fabric. And it is deeply worrying. To me, that is one of the most worrying aspects of India today is the demonization of our Muslim brothers and sisters. And that must stop. And the lead must come from, I'll tell a story here. I must tell a story because I told it just the other day in another talk.
Yes, sir.
In 1965, India and Pakistan went to war. During the war, our Prime Minister, you will remember, was Lal Bahadur Shastri in 1965. When India and Pakistan were at war, Lal Bahadur Shastri gave a public lecture in the Ram Leela Maidan in Delhi during the war, mobilizing, support for the war. And in this lecture, he began by saying, to my left, he said it in Hindi, but I'm going to say it in English. He said, to my left is Mir Mushtaq Ahmed, President of the Delhi Congress. He is my friend and my comrade. To my right is Frank Anthony, barrister and member of parliament. He is also my friend and my comrade. Can this happen in Pakistan? That Ayub Khan will give a public lecture soliciting support with a Hindu to his left and a Christian to his right? No. He said that is what makes us different from Pakistan. Now, that is the kind of lecture Narendra Modi should be giving today. A public lecture with a prominent Muslim to his left, a prominent Christian to his right, and not just symbolically to mean it. Just the other day, about a few weeks ago, there's a very good columnist in the Times of India called Swaminathan Anklaserya Iyer, who's a very respected columnist, writes very sensible articles. And he said the Prime Minister has gone to Ayodhya. When the mosque, for the inauguration of the Ram Temple, when the mosque is built, he should go for that inauguration too. So the Prime Minister must show that he does not discriminate on the grounds of religion. That's what Shastri would have done. You know, the BJP claims to admire Shastri, but they don't learn the wise things from Shastri. Just think of the lecture Shastri gave when we were fighting Pakistan in 1965. He said, to my left is my comrade Mir Mushtaq Ahmed, to my right is my comrade Frank Anthony. That is what makes us different from Pakistan.
Sir, can I come to the next question, sir?
Please.
Yeah. It's a very long question. It's asked by Deepjyoti Nath from our college. As a product of colonial legacy, the ideals of modernity such as rationality, reason, objectivity, and many others were implemented in the Indian context initially for promoting nationalism and later for industrialization, capitalism, secularism, etc. These colonial legacies have obviously challenged India's self-conception not only at the initial years of independence, but today also. So my question is, how Gandhian philosophy can address this dilemma between modernity and spirituality in the present day India?
So I think, the greatness of people like Gandhi and Tagore was they knew that as Gandhi said, the windows of my house are open and the breezes will come in from everywhere. As Tagore said, I glory in the illumination of a lamp lit anywhere in the world. We must be open to the world and learn from the world and not have a blind worship of our own culture or our own religion. And I think during the colonial era, I think the British, we looked at ourselves in the mirror and we investigated our own faults. I mean, today's Hindutva is unlike the Hinduism of Gandhi and Tagore and Vivekananda, which is self-critical, always improving, always seeing the faults within and trying to rectify them. And today's Hindutva believes Hindus are perfect, they were always perfect, they need no improvement. And I think that is totally antithetical to the way Gandhi saw the encounter of East and West.
Hello, sir. Hello,
Yeah.
sir.
Go ahead.
Okay, sir. I would like to come to the second question. In recent times, with the prevalence of the generally more hostile atmosphere, how can we cultivate our inner Gandhi? In recent times, with the prevalence of a generally more hostile atmosphere, how can we cultivate our inner Gandhi? Or is that indeed a utopian concept? It's Arman Mathur.
That's a very good question from Arman Mathur, but I cannot prescribe how to cultivate your inner Gandhi. I can only tell you what Gandhi thought, what he believed in, and to what extent his ideas are relevant today. Personal advice to young people is not the job of a scholar. The job of a scholar is to analyze the past and present it in all its complexity and diversity. So, all of us will have to learn in our own way, following our own conscience, how to cultivate our inner Gandhi. I can't advise on that. By the way, I should also say that though I'm a scholar of Gandhi, I'm not a Gandhian. I'm not a Gandhian. I might have an occasional drink. When I was young, I used to smoke. I travel by air. I don't travel by third class. So I'm not a Gandhian. I'm a scholar of Gandhi. I'd say the only two aspects of Gandhi that I that I've imbibed personally. One is I'm always on time, and the other are the answer letters that come to me. I don't get letters, and even the most abusive letters that come to me, I answer. Not on social media, but my email address is in the public domain, and all of you will know, those of you who correspond to me, that I do. But I'm not a Gandhian, so I can't tell you personally how to live the life Gandhi did. I'm a scholar of Gandhi and his times.
Okay. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, you in your lectures you often say that Gandhi didn't have a proper understanding of music.
Yeah.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. He had rudimentary understanding of music. During his lifetime, he watched only one movie, that is Ram Rai,
Yes.
of time. And one of the things that dominate the psyche of India is the movie. So,
Yes.
what would be your views on that, sir?
No, I think, I mean, this is a talk on Gandhi, but this is a webinar on Gandhi.
Yeah.
But, I think it's very important. I said I'm not a Gandhian, which means I don't admire Gandhi undeservedly. And Gandhi is one of the people I admired, but so are many other great Indians. I mean, Tagore I have mentioned, Nehru I have mentioned, Baba Sahib Ambedkar would be another,
Yeah.
Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay from a home state of Karnataka would be another. Now, Kamala Devi, for example, was a remarkable Indian feminist who had a sense of joy and fun and loved music and dance as well, right? And so I think Gandhi also did not like cricket. I love cricket. Gandhi never watched a cricket match in his life, right? So I think there was a kind of rather austere, abstemious side to Gandhi, which sometimes detracted from his attractiveness. On the other hand, he had a sense of humor, and he could laugh at himself. I mean, one of the nicest things about Gandhi was his ability to laugh at himself, which powerful and famous people very rarely can do. But the sense of, I mean, and I think Gandhi would have himself said that his musical knowledge was underdeveloped. His aesthetic sense was underdeveloped. His appreciation of great art was underdeveloped. I'm sure he would have acknowledged that himself. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Okay. Sir, can I come to the next question?
Please.
Okay, sir. There is one question that Gandhi's views on the Moplah massacre, criticism of his stand on Hindu-Muslim unity, even from the likes of Ambedkar and Annie Besant. Recently, the Hindu right has used that incident to tarnish Gandhi's secular image.
No,
Should I
that-
read it out again, sir?
No, I heard you. There are 90 volumes of Gandhi's collected works. It's very easy to pick 3 lines and distort what he said. Right. From something he said somewhere without the context, without looking at the overall trajectory of his views. It often happens, for example, with race. When Gandhi was young, he made some racist remarks, but he outgrew his racism quite, in later life. And for most of his later life, he was a principled anti-racist. So a select, this is very typical of WhatsApp University. You take 2 lines out of, a million words someone might have written, and I am subject to that. I mean, I write a weekly column, and occasionally you'll find in social media a line I've said has been taken out of context, and Guha believes this or Guha believes that without the larger context of what he said. So clearly, there is a difference between someone like Gandhi and Nehru on the one side, who believed that Hindus and Muslims have an equal right to Indian territory, Indian culture, Indian economy, Indian polity, Indian moral space. That's Gandhi and Nehru on the one side. And there's the RSS on the other, who believe this is essentially Hindu country and Muslims and Christians live here on sufferance. Or Savarkar and RSS on the other side. So that is a clear difference which no one can dispute. But I think taking one line he wrote said about the Moplah massacre and taking it out of context is not the way you conduct a scholarly debate. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yes, sir. Fine, sir. Fine. Sir, it's in the context of modern India, I mean, the present India, what it means to be a Gandhian.
So I think what it means to be a Gandhian today is absolute opposition to caste and gender discrimination, absolute commitment to Hindu-Muslim harmony, absolute commitment to environmental responsibility, and absolute commitment to truth-telling, and finally, absolute commitment to non-violence in word and in action. That when you're dealing with someone, never call them personal names. Have tamiz. To use the Urdu word. Tamiz. Debate their arguments, but don't say he's saying this because somebody has paid him or because he belongs to this party and so on. So these are the four or five things I think we can learn from Gandhi. To repeat,
Yes.
absolute commitment to caste and gender equality, absolute commitment to Hindu-Muslim harmony, absolute commitment to telling the truth, at least when it comes to public debate, and to courtesy in public debate, and to environmental responsibility. And India needs all of these things today. India needs all of these things today if it has to nurture for itself a wiser and better future. But that doesn't mean Gandhi has all the answers. For other things, for a perspective on India and the world, you would have to go to Tagore. For understanding the operations of federalism and the constitution, you have to go to Ambedkar. For and so on and so forth. So Gandhi is one of our lodestars, but not the only lodestar. Karl Marx, the great social theorist of the 19th century, famously said, "I am not a Marxist." He lived long enough to say, "I am not a Marxist."
Yes.
Ambedkar, if he was alive today, would say, "I am not an Ambedkarite," and Gandhi would say, "I am not a Gandhian." I think Gandhi is one great thinker, but we've had many others, and we can learn from all of them.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Often there is the criticism that Gandhi supported British in the World War. Also, he participated in the Zulu War. So, what would be your view on that?
So he did not participate in the Zulu War. He had an ambulance campaign which attended to the wounded, including to the Zulu wounded. Again, read my book, Gandhi Before India. He attended to the Zulu wounded as well as the British wounded. That's the truth, that he did not pick up guns, but he attended to the wounded people, both on the British side and on the Zulu side. And that's what humanitarians would do.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So there is often a comparative study between Gandhi and Karl Marx. It's a kind of celebrated kind of debate. It's a very serious kind of question. So what would be your views on that? If you compare between Gandhi and Marx, who is going to be very, very relevant in future?
No, I think Marx was a great and visionary thinker, and his two profound insights. One is that social conflict is endemic in society, that people who are divided by class, by economic opportunity or class, tend to become adversarial towards one another. And the other great insight of Marx, which in some ways is actually his greater insight, is that technology is an autonomous force in history. Technology transforms social relations in ways that I can't anticipate. If you look at how the smartphone or the personal computer or the telephone or the automobile or the telegraph transformed us in earlier generations. So Marx was a great and profound thinker, but he was also a utopian thinker who was often wrong. Marx thought that the working class in the West would get steadily poorer. That did not happen. Marx thought violence was the most logical way to bring about social change. That has proved to be counterproductive. So to understand even 21st century, you need Marx, but you need to go well beyond Marx. To build a better society, you need Gandhi, but you need to go more beyond Gandhi. That's how, Gandhi, Marx is no one can be a social scientist and not read Marx deeply. But there are other great social scientists. There was Max Weber, there's Emil Durkheim, Indian sociologists, Indian anthropologists, and so on and so forth. And politically, one has to choose. The Gandhian way of non-violence versus the Marx or the Marx-Lenin way of revolutionary violence. And I'm clear that violence is not a way of settling political disputes within a country. India needs an army to protect its borders against its enemies, against Chinese incursion. We need an army. But within India, we don't need to use force. I think I absolutely abhor the use of force by secessionist groups in the Northeast and also by the Naxalites in central India. I think within a country, you must bring about change through non-violent collective action and through rational argument and debate, never at the point of a gun. And that's where I stand totally with Gandhi and against the Marxists.
So thank you so much. Shall we come to the next question, sir?
Yeah.
Gandhi is the product of India. While his importance is gradually increasing across the world, but in India, he is, in many ways, we can say that he is in a state of oblivion. So what would be your views on that, sir?
That's true. That's a very perceptive remark. I would not say in a state of oblivion. many Indians have an adversarial attitude to Gandhi. So the
Yeah.
admirers of Bose attack Gandhi. The admirers of Ambedkar admire Gandhi. The admirers of Savarkar attack Gandhi. Modernizers who think he was anti-development attack Gandhi, and so on and so forth. Right. So Gandhi is a figure of debate, animosity, argument in India. But that's how it is. That's fine. We can have our arguments with Gandhi as long as they are based on some kind of fidelity to the truth and not to a perverted, distorted version of the truth. At the same time, Gandhi is greatly admired outside India. It may be that, like the Buddha, since you early on in your talk, you or maybe the principal mentioned the Buddha, like the Buddha, it may be Gandhi's melancholy fate that India throws him out and the rest of the world affirms him. Because to the rest of the world, his truth, his transparency, his decency, his commitment to religious toleration, to non-violence, to environmental responsibility may appeal. It may not appeal to us, it may appeal to the rest of the world, and good luck to them. I mean, they deserve Gandhi more than we deserve Gandhi. That is what might happen, yeah.
Okay, sir. Sir, would you agree with the view that Gandhi has been appropriated? Gandhi has been appropriated by what is generally known as left liberals. That is, the left liberal entity wants a certain narrative to thrive.
I don't think so. I don't think that Gandhi has been appropriated by anyone. If you look at his whole lifetime, if you look at the people who followed him, they were left liberals like Nehru, but they were also classical conservatives like Rajagopalachari. I mean, Rajagopalachari was inspired by Gandhi to start a Swatantra Party because he believed in reducing the power of the state. Social workers like Vinoba Bhave, Miraben, the whole environmental movement is inspired by Gandhi. So there are many strands that have responded to Gandhi positively. There are many other strands that have responded to Gandhi negatively. The thing about Gandhi is he cannot be classified in conventional political terms. Gandhi is not left. He's not a socialist, he's not a liberal, and he's not a conservative. At different points in his life, he is a socialist or at other points liberal, other points conservative. Sometimes he's his own man with his own original understanding of how the world is going. Traditionally, the left detested Gandhi. Today, it's the right that detests Gandhi. Today, it's the Hindutva-vadis who attack Gandhi, either overtly or covertly. In Gandhi's lifetime, the most savage attacks on him came from the Marxist left. And even after his lifetime, during the Gandhi centenary celebration of 1969, the Naxalites were beheading Gandhi statues all over Eastern India. So, Gandhi makes extreme leftists uncomfortable. He makes extreme rightists uncomfortable as well. That's part of his beauty, that he doesn't, no political party can, really own him completely. Yeah.
Let me come to the next question. Gandhi has taught us by personal example that being a devout Hindu and a devout secularist are not mutually incompatible, but actually complementary to each other. With the increasing perversion of Hinduism in the form of Hindutva, do you think that syncretic ethos is slowly fading away?
Yes, it is. It is indeed. And, Gandhi was a deeply believing Hindu, but he was a heterodox Hindu. Gandhi believed in interfaith dialogue. He had open-air prayer meetings where he read passages from the Gita and the Quran and the Bible. Gandhi never went to a temple. Gandhi would have been appalled by the temple in Ayodhya, the new temple, because Gandhi's Ram was in his heart. Gandhi didn't need a big, grand, expensive temple to exhibit his love for Ram. And Gandhi's Ram was also called Allah, which is, the line of Raghupati Raghav Raja Ram. Ishwar Allah Tere Naam. He said, so I think Gandhi practiced a kind of syncretic, plural, tolerant, inclusive Hinduism, and it did not need a grand structure. He did not need a grand structure to proclaim his devotion. It was inside him and in his everyday life. And we need much more of that kind of Hinduism today if India is going to survive in any kind of recognizable way.
So many participants have asked this question, that was Gandhi responsible for the creation of Pakistan? If he is not, why he was very much vocal about Muslims in India but he was not at all vocal about the atrocities meted out for for the Hindus in Pakistan.
That is total nonsense, and it's someone has been educating themselves on WhatsApp University. If Gandhi had not been murdered in Delhi by Godse, he was going across the border to the Punjab the next month, and he was going to work for the rights of Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan. That's what he was committed to. Likewise in India, I mean, he first worked among the persecuted Hindus in Noakhali, and then he went to work among the persecuted Muslims in Bihar. So this is utter nonsense, and it's a question that only betrays the ignorance of the questioner. I'm sorry.
Many critics commented that Gandhi's thinking is outdated, but do you agree with their view?
No, in some ways it is outdated. I've discussed this, as I said. In some ways it is outdated. Young people need mobility. They want opportunity. They like to travel. Gandhi was not that keen on people traveling. He wanted local self-reliance, Gram Swaraj. So in some respects, it is outdated. In other respects, it is timeless and still entirely relevant. I mean, in a country in which there's so much suspicion between Hindus and Muslims, his creed of Hindu-Muslim harmony is extremely relevant. In a country in which women and Dalits are still oppressed, his creed of caste and gender equality is extremely relevant. In a country in which environmental devastation is so rampant, his ideas on environmental responsibility are relevant. So there are aspects of Gandhi's life that resonate. And other aspect, Gandhi could not have told us how to handle, WhatsApp University, for example, fake news, or how to deal with COVID, for example, is not something we can take really many clues from Gandhi. So obviously he's a product of his time, and some of the things he said were relevant to his time, but other things are timeless. I mean, other things are timeless, and we have to discriminate between what in Gandhi is timeless and what was contingent and relevant only when he was writing it during his lifetime.
Thank you, sir. There is one question from Dr. Debartha Morang from Cotton University. How does Gandhian philosophy help to preserve our ecology? I think this is the age where the ecology part has been questioned, and we are very much concerned about that. I think this is a relevant question. How does Gandhian philosophy help to preserve our ecology?
It's a very important question. I can't give you a short answer, but
yes, sir.
I have a book called How Much Should a Person Consume, which is still in print, and that a large section of that book talks about Gandhi's attitude to ecology and the environment, and in what ways it is relevant today. So those of you who are interested, that it's the title essay, How Much Should a Person Consume, ? Was published in the Journal of IIM Ahmedabad and will probably be available online through JSTOR or something. So if you just Google Ramachandra Guha, How Much Should a Person Consume, you'll, I can't give you a soundbite answer because it's a complex subject. The environmental crisis facing India and the globe today, and what we can learn from Gandhi in tackling this national and global environmental crisis. Do look at my essay and my book, How Much Should a Person Consume? ?
So let me come to another relevant question. What would be your analysis on Gandhi as a writer?
Yeah,
because that is one of the
I'm glad to have that question. If I may tell an anecdote about this, and I'll come to that. Okay, I was in New York just before COVID broke in February. And there's a very fine writer in New York of Indian origin called Atish Tasir, whose OCI card has been removed by the Modi government because he wrote against them. So I went to see him. He's a young writer. He can't come to my country, even though it's his country too. So I was in New York and we were chatting. And we were for those of you who know New York, there may be some people who know New York, there's a wonderful bookstore called Strand Bookstore near the village. And I told him we'll meet in Strand Bookstore and then we'll go for a coffee. And near Strand Bookstore is a lovely statue of Gandhi. So I told Atish, did you know that there's a statue of Gandhi? He said, no. He said, no. So we went to the statue of Gandhi. And at that statue of Gandhi, Atish said, I want to take a selfie of you and me with Gandhi's statue. So this statue, we were standing on either side. A friendly New York lady took a selfie of the three of us, took a photo which that Atish posted on Instagram. And there was, of course, a lot of abusive comments by, Hindutva people and so on. But so there was Gandhi. To my left, to Gandhi's left was me, to Gandhi's right was Atish. But one comment said, and it really pleased me, one comment said, 3 fine writers. Because Atish and me were professional writers, and of course Gandhi was the greatest writer of all. But another one said 3 brave men, but 3 fine writers was very nice. I was very touched by that because Gandhi was a great writer, and in Gujarati and in English, he was a master of Gujarati prose and of English prose. I mean, he transformed Gujarati prose very substantially, maybe not as substantially as Tagore transformed Bengali prose, but he is regarded as a modern master. But he was a very clear, lucid, elegant writer who never obfuscated, who never used excessive jargon. Particularly, those of you who are students of English literature know how much jargon English literature professors nowadays and philosophy professors nowadays use. Gandhi never used jargon. He was clear, transparent, prose like a window pane, as someone said of Orwell. So, and he loved writing. He was always writing. That's why there are 90 volumes of his collected works. In South Africa, he edited a newspaper called Indian Opinion. In India, he also edited a newspaper, first called Young India and then Harijan. So he was, that is part of the Gandhi's great gift. And it's not unique to Gandhi. It's quite unusual.
Yes.
How many political leaders of that time were outstanding writers? Nehru was a wonderful stylist. Discovery of India is a fabulous book. Ambedkar was a superb writer. Rajagopalachari was an outstanding writer. Savarkar was a fine writer in Marathi and to a limited extent in English. So many of the political activists of the colonial period were actually also writers too, right up to Lohia and Jayaprakash Narayan. If there's a book in Narendra Modi's name, but does not know whether Narendra Modi wrote it or a ghostwriter. If there's a book in Sonia Gandhi's name, likewise, maybe to a limited extent, Shashi Tharoor is an example of a writer-politician, but Gandhi was an outstanding writer, as were many other political leaders of his day.
So thank you so much. Thank you, sir, really very much for this particular question, for analysis, of Gandhi as a writer. Sir, again, one sensitive question. Gandhiji did experiment of celibacy. And at the time, when India was passing through one of the very, very critical phases. So, sir, what would be your views on that?
So again, this is like the environment question. This is a very complex question that can't be answered through a soundbite. There's a chapter in the second volume of my Gandhi biography, Gandhi, the Years That Changed the World. The chapter is called The Strangest Experiment. And it's a full chapter analyzing why Gandhi undertook this strange, bizarre experiment. What were his motivations? What were his anxieties? And so on and so forth. So please read that chapter, The Strangest Experiment, if you want a proper answer.
Yeah, I certainly want. Sir, again, I would like to come to another question. What is your take on Gandhi, as a personal, Gandhi as a father and Gandhi as a husband? Because, in your book, the book that you have right now, you have mentioned that Gandhi was a flawed father and flawed husband.
Yes, without question. No, without
Gandhi
question. Go ahead. Sorry.
So in your book, the book that you have just now mentioned, there you particularly mentioned that Gandhi was a flawed father and Gandhi was a flawed husband. Now, how can a flawed husband and flawed father can lead a nation?
No, I think that is the cost of his public life. It's true of many, great figures. Einstein, for example, Picasso, many great public figures were so driven and so motivated by their science or their art or their activism. You find this kind of stuff. Again, if I will tell you an anecdote, there's a very prominent trade union leader whom I'll not mention, very well-known trade union leader of the Communist Party of India, very upright old communist. I met his son once, and I told him, I met your father, very nice man. I met him once, and the son said, I have also met him once. Because when he was growing up in the communal, the father was always involved in trade union activity, he was neglected. So it's there, and I had to tell the story truthfully of what an awful father Gandhi was, particularly with regard to Harilal, his eldest son. And to a limited extent, Gandhi learned from his mistakes. Gandhi had Harilal when he was 18. He was very young. Most of us have our children in our late 20s or early 30s. And Gandhi had Harilal when he was 18. when Harilal was passing through his adolescent crisis, when Harilal was 18 and wanted to have a career as a lawyer, Gandhi was passing through his midlife crisis, wanting to give up his career as a successful lawyer and become a social activist. And the midlife crisis of the father and the adolescent crisis of the son clashed and led to this terrible outcome, and Harilal suffered so much. Later on, Gandhi was more understanding towards Ramdas, his third son, and Petri Devdas, his youngest son, with whom he had a very close and mutually beneficial relationship for a very long time, from 1920s till the late 1940s. But there's no question that he was really, Harilal was suffered greatly because of his father's lack of understanding and his father's judgmentalism and his father's desire to make the son in his own image. And that is, he was a deeply flawed father and also a flawed husband, maybe slightly less flawed, but certainly a flawed husband.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Sir, again, one hypothetical question. If Gandhi had been alive for another 5 years, what change it would have made in the world?
Well, you see, these are questions that are impossible to answer because they're purely hypothetical. I'd say, I can tell you what happened because Gandhi died when he did.
Yes.
Actually, Gandhi's death at the hands of a Hindu fundamentalist horrified Hindus. If Gandhi had not been killed, the civil war between Hindus and Muslims would have continued because however great and however heroic one man was, he couldn't have stopped the war by repeated fasts. So when he died, Hindus in India were horrified. The RSS was banned, and Nehru was able to bring about some kind of social peace. Nehru and Patel were able to bring about some kind of social peace and harmony and bring the nation together, unite the princely states, frame the constitution, hold the first election, and India was able to embark on a journey of a united and democratic country. But if that man had not murdered Gandhi, and maybe Hindus would have continued to take revenge for what was happening in Pakistan. So Gandhi's death in a curious way, premature death in a curious way, may have saved Indian unity, at least temporarily. All right. Now that's my view. Now, what would, if he had actually lived another 5 years, let's assume that the civil war would have died down, and through force of moral example and with the help of Nehru and Patel, Gandhi had been able to restore some civic life in India that was so threatened in 1947 and 1948. I think Gandhi's main emphasis would have been building a civil society movement, to keep the state to account. Gandhi would have nurtured a civil society movement of social activists across India, which did not happen. The political side of Gandhi was taken over by Nehru and Patel, and they did a great job in uniting India and giving it a democratic constitution. But the social work, constructive work side, work on promoting Hindu-Muslim harmony at the grassroots level, work on, designing technologies for the rural economy, work on ending untouchability, the campaign against untouchability. Gandhians did not take it up after Gandhi's death. If Gandhi had been alive, all these things would have got the kind of emphasis that they needed. But it's hard to say on balance whether his martyrdom helped India or hindered India. My view is that it helped India because we were so horrified. Indians were so horrified that they killed the person who brought us freedom. The greatest moral exemplar we had. They were horrified into stopping the violence and constructing a democratic and secular society.
Sir, there is a question. To you, sir. You have written books, so many books on, varied interest. You have written books on ecology, you have written books on forestry, you have written books on cricket. But nevertheless, your books on Gandhi are widely acclaimed. You are specifically acclaimed for your books on Gandhi. So what was the first cause that you got attracted to Gandhi first as a writer?
So, I got attracted to Gandhi while doing my PhD, because my PhD was a study of the Chipko movement. And the leaders of the Chipko movement were inspired by Gandhi. They were, there's a phrase in music, Dada Guru, your Guru's Guru. And for the great leader of the Chipko movement, Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Sundarlal Bahuguna, Gandhi was the Dada Guru. They had not seen Gandhi personally. But the people they had been inspired by, like JP, Vinoba Bhave, Sarla Ben had worked with Gandhi. And there was in terms of their commitment to non-violence, Hindu-Muslim harmony, their dignity of personal behavior, they were very, very Gandhian, those Chipko movement leaders. And so my first interest in Gandhi came from seeing Gandhians in the flesh, doing extraordinary work. They were very inspiring people. I mean, they're both still alive. They're both, Chandi Prasad in his late 80s, Sundarraji in his early 90s. They're fragile. There's also an amazing woman called Radha Bhatt, who's 87 and lives in Kausani, who's a leading Gandhian, one of the leading Gandhian social workers of Kumaon, whom I've also had the privilege of knowing. So knowing these extraordinary social workers, men and women inspired by Gandhi to dedicate their lives to the emancipation of rural India, committed to social equality, to very disciplined hours of hard work, also with joy, affection, humor, never dull and boring in the way some left-wing activists can be, So that's really first got me. Then I started reading more about Gandhi. And then I realized that there was a major vacuum in the literature on Gandhi, in that most people who wrote on Gandhi had relied on the 90 volumes of the collected works. And in the course of my other research on different subjects, I found a lot of unpublished material on Gandhi in different archives around the world. And I described some of my research techniques in my books. And then I thought I must write a book on Gandhi. And it eventually became 2 volumes because I got so much new material on South Africa. And I realized that it's in South Africa that Gandhi was formed as a thinker, an actor, a philosopher, a social reformer. So that's how it became 2 volumes. But the interest in Gandhi starts with my work on the Chipko movement and meeting, seeing the living legacy of Gandhi at work in the Himalaya.
Okay. Sir, Gandhi had certain habits. His experiment with food, his experiment with, so many other things, and particularly his walking. Now, these aspects of Gandhi are very, very relevant for the up.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned his walking because, I was, it's linked to Gandhi, the environmentalist. America is a country. So one of the contrasts between Europe and America is Europe has very good public transport. If you want to go from London to Paris, you can take a train. If you want to go from New York to Boston, the train, of course, now there's a train, but most places there are no trains. Most people prefer driving in the car, metros in the cities. So public transport is very good in Europe. In America, each person wants a car, sometimes 2 cars. And unfortunately, India has followed that model. That's why we have such disastrous public transport. Now, some American cities are belatedly trying to promote public transport. Some years ago, I was in a very large city called Phoenix in Arizona, which has 2 million people. And typically there people only had cars. And now they were promoting public transport. And the municipality was advertising public transport by saying, you don't need a car, even Gandhi walked, So Gandhi's love of walking was inspiring, a movement against the public, private automobile in Arizona. So walking, walking, I find, for example, walking is something, Gandhi used his walk for many things. I mean, he used it, of course, to promote peace, to promote Hindu-Muslim harmony, to breach the salt laws, but every day he walked. And I think it's great discipline. I mean, it's great. I also, I'm fortunate in Bangalore that I have a very nice park, Cubbon Park, very close to my house. But it's also, walking is a way in which you can clear your mind, think. I mean, I'm sure for you also, Dr. Saikia, for writers and professors, it's a very curative kind of habit. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir, there is one question from one of our students from our department. It's a long question. Rajmohan Gandhi in his book quoted Swami Satchidanand, who was earlier supporter of Gandhi's non-violence, and later on, after Indo-China war, he started thinking non-violence and Gandhian philosophy was major cause behind this. Then he left this philosophy. Sir, many people in today's India have same idea, who believe that non-violence has no relevance today. So as in the beginning of your lecture, you quoted for the 4 pillar, but today, many of them, particularly non-violence, we are forgetting. So, sir, how you see the future of India in Gandhian framework.
So I think, as I said, of course you need an army. To protect ourselves against the enemies on the border, we need an army. But in settling our own domestic disputes, we don't need violence, and we don't even need violence in debate and argument. I mean, one of the most distressing aspects of the last decade in India is the venom and animosity with which people disagree. John Lewis, John Lewis, I think was mentioned earlier in this webinar, the great civil rights leader of America who died recently, and his admiration for Gandhi was mentioned. John Lewis once said, someone asked him, what can I learn from you? He said, disagree without being disagreeable. Disagree without being disagreeable. And I think this violence of language is more than the violence of physical violence. The violence of language, the suspicion, the distrust that it breeds is not at all healthy in a country like ours. I mean, the fraternity, the camaraderie, the shared citizenship that we need, must rest on a shared, at least sense that you don't accuse the other person of bad faith. At least have some respect for that person as a human being. So I don't see where violence, either in deed or in word, is going to get us. I think it's very distressing, this kind of, fetish of violence that is now emerging among young men, not so much among young women, but among young men. I think it's extremely disturbing.
Disturbing, yes, sir. And then, sir, shall I take some more questions, sir?
Maybe another 5-10 minutes.
Okay, sir. Okay, fine. Sir, how did Gandhian thought distinguish the concept of state and the concept of government? How did Gandhian thought distinguish the concept of state and the concept of government? Do you think in present times concepts are mixed up?
Well, I don't think Gandhi really thought about these things seriously. Ambedkar would probably be a better person to go to. Probably some, other political philosophers. I don't think, because Gandhi was never part of a government. He never joined even a legislative assembly. When the Congress came to power in 1937, he didn't fight an election. He didn't come to power. He didn't join the Constituent Assembly. He didn't follow the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly very seriously. He was interested in other things like Hindu-Muslim harmony and so on. So Gandhi has been called a gentle anarchist. I mean, he worked outside the domain of the state, but unlike other anarchists who are militant and violent, he's a gentle anarchist. So I think to understand this relationship with state and governance, Gandhi is not the right person to go to. Maybe Ambedkar or some other people like Ambedkar would be more useful.
Okay. Sir, one more question. I mean, so many people are asking these questions regarding conflict between Ambedkar and Gandhi.
Yeah.
Often talk about this also.
So, again, it's dealt with over several chapters of my book, Gandhi, the Years That Changed the World. If you can't read the whole book, read the epilogue, where I argue that we need Gandhi and Ambedkar both. India at that time needed Gandhi and Ambedkar both, because Gandhi was the greatest upper caste reformer, guilt-ridden upper caste reformer. No upper caste Hindu did more to challenge untouchability than Gandhi. Ambedkar was from below, the leader of his own people. He was more radical, he was more militant. He changed Gandhi's views. Gandhi's views evolved. He became, from somewhat timid in attacking the caste system, he became more and more direct and confrontational. And Gandhi himself started overseeing marriages between Suvarnas and Dalits, which basically, once you have those kinds of marriages, you're undermining the whole bedrock of the caste system. And of course, the whole movement for temple entry that Gandhi led. So I think we don't have to choose between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Of course, they disagreed. They had different perspectives, but those perspectives are complementary. Social change comes when oppressive, obnoxious social practice is challenged from below and from above. And even today, I think we need them both. I wrote an article in the Telegraph some months ago on why we need Gandhi and Ambedkar both. You can certainly Google that.
Yes. So let me come to the final question. The final question is, what is your final take on Gandhi?
Well, I don't have a final take. He was one of 4 or 5 truly great Indians. I mean, for me, I'd say Tagore, Ambedkar, and Gandhi. Sort of in terms of 20th. But among those 3 Indians, he may have had the greatest universal reach. his ideas on interfaith harmony, on non-violence, on environmental sustainability travel outside India quite easily. He led as a biographer, he wrote a great deal. He led a transparent life. There's a lot about him, a lot of criticism of him, appreciation of him. He lived in 3 continents, India, England, and South Africa. So he touched many different parts of the world. So for a historian, he's a person of abiding interest. He lived a long life. He touched many things. He was controversial. So that's what makes him appealing to a biographer. Since I've written 2,000 pages on Gandhi, I can't have a final take on him. Read the whole 2,000 pages, then you'll see what I think about that.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely, sir. Sir, thank you so much.